They said it was just a studio. A quiet, isolated mansion tucked deep in the French countryside, where the world's most famous musicians came to escape the noise of fame. It had high stone walls, wooden floors that creaked like they had a memory of every song ever recorded there, and long candlelit hallways that seemed to breathe. On the outside, it looked peaceful, but on the inside, it was anything but. The place was called Chateau de Rouville, and during the 1970s, it was one of Europe's most legendary studios. Elton John called it Honky Chateau. David Bowie recorded there. Pink Floyd, Iggy Pop, even Fleetwood Mac passed through its doors, and in the middle of it all came three brothers, Barry, Robin, and Maurice Gibb, the Bee Gees. By the time they arrived, their fame was fading. Their sound, once bright and full of harmony, was being called outdated. The world had moved on, and the brothers were desperate for a comeback. So they rented out the chateau, hoping its quiet countryside would help them focus. But according to people who were there, the silence became something else. It's been almost 50 years, but rumors still swirl about those nights in France. Engineers claimed they'd hear strange sounds through the recording equipment, faint voices, footsteps, whispers in the static. A few musicians who worked at the chateau swore they'd hear a piano playing softly in an empty room. Others said the Bee Gees would stop recording mid-song, claiming they heard someone singing along with them, even though no one else was in the booth. None of this was ever confirmed, but the whispers never went away. Barry, the eldest, wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He was a perfectionist, focused, calm, always in control, but something about that place got to him. Even decades later, when interviewers bring up those sessions, Barry grows quiet. He doesn't joke, he doesn't smile, he just says that place had its own spirit. And then he changes the subject. No one knows exactly what happened inside that mansion. Not even the brothers themselves agreed on what they felt there. But what's certain is that Barry Gibb left that chateau a different man. Some say it was stress, some say exhaustion, and some say it was something else entirely. For years he refused to talk about it. But now at 79, he's finally admitted enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the old stories weren't as wild as people thought. He didn't reveal everything, but what he did say shocked even longtime fans, because it wasn't just about music, it was about what the mind can endure when fame, isolation, and pressure collide. So what really happened behind those stone walls? What did Barry hear in those echoing halls? And what finally made him break his silence nearly half a century later? You're about to find out. You're watching RetroWaves, where the greatest stories in music come back to life. The secrets, the heartbreaks, and the moments that changed everything. If you love the Bee Gees, if their songs have ever made you feel something deep, or if you've ever wondered what happened between the hits, then this is your place. Make sure to subscribe and tap the bell, because what you're about to hear isn't just another Bee Gees story. It's the one no one wanted to tell. A story that begins in a haunted French mansion, where Barry Gibb's confidence was tested, his sanity questioned, and his faith in music forever changed. At 79, he finally confirmed what fans had whispered about for decades, that the French Château wasn't just another studio, it was a place that held a secret. And now, we're going to uncover it. By the early 1970s, the Bee Gees had gone from chart-topping superstars to yesterday's news. They had conquered the 1960s with songs like Massachusetts, Words, and To Love Somebody, tracks that defined an entire generation. Their harmonies were unmatched, their melodies flawless, but fame has a way of fading faster than anyone expects. When the decade turned, their elegant pop sound suddenly felt out of place. The world was changing, rock was growing louder, disco hadn't yet arrived, and somewhere in between, the Bee Gees found themselves stranded, too soft for rock, too traditional for the new pop wave. Critics wrote them off, radio stations stopped playing their songs, even record executives began to doubt them. The brothers could feel it slipping away, the fans, the energy, the spotlight, and nothing hurts more than being forgotten while you're still standing there on the stage. Barry, Robin, and Maurice had always been close. They were brothers by blood, partners by choice, and rivals by instinct. But now, the pressure to survive in a changing music world began to pull them apart. Robin wanted to experiment, to return to emotional ballads. Barry, ever the visionary, wanted to reinvent their sound completely, and Maurice just wanted peace between them. For a time, that peace broke. Robin left the group in frustration, trying his luck as a solo artist. Barry and Maurice carried on, but the magic wasn't the same. When Robin eventually returned, the reconciliation was polite, not perfect. They were brothers again, yes, but something had changed in the way they looked at each other. There was still love, but also a quiet kind of distance. By 1974, the Bee Gees were standing on a cliff edge, emotionally and creatively. Their albums weren't charting, their shows weren't selling, and Barry knew that if they didn't find a way to evolve, it would all be over, so he made a decision. They would leave everything familiar behind. England, the studios, the critics, the noise, gone. They would go somewhere quiet, somewhere no one could find them, a place where they could focus, rebuild, and maybe rediscover what had been lost. That's when someone suggested a studio outside Paris, a grand old mansion turned recording facility called Chateau de Hauteville. It had a strange reputation, but also a legendary one. Elton John had recorded Honky Chateau there. David Bowie had worked on pinups. Pink Floyd had even used it for sessions. Every artist who passed through seemed to leave with an unforgettable story, though not always a good one. According to rumor, the chateau had been built centuries earlier on the ruins of an old monastery. Some said it carried the echoes of prayers, trapped within its walls. Others believed a painter had lived there in the 1800s and had mysteriously disappeared. No record of that was ever confirmed, but the stories persisted. There were also tales of artists who left in the middle of recording, claiming the place felt wrong. Engineers who refused to work past midnight because of noises that came from the cellar. Most called it superstition. But in the music world, where emotion and exhaustion often blur the line between real and imagined, such stories tend to stick. When the Bee Gees heard about it, they didn't care about the rumors, they cared about results. Barry told his brothers, "We need somewhere to think, somewhere to breathe." And the Chateau de Hauteville promised exactly that: isolation, quiet, and space to dream. When they arrived, the first thing Barry noticed was the silence. It wasn't peaceful, it was thick. The kind of silence that presses against your chest. The studio itself was stunning. Chandeliers, velvet curtains, massive wooden beams, and rooms that smelled faintly of pine and dust. But under that beauty there was something else, something Barry couldn't quite name. At first it was small things, a guitar that went out of tune overnight, a faint hum through the speakers that disappeared whenever the engineers checked, footsteps in the hallway after everyone had gone to bed. The crew brushed it off. Old buildings make sounds, they said, but Barry couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them work. The Bee Gees set up their equipment and began writing. Days turned into nights. Nights turned into something stranger. The pressure on Barry was immense. He wasn't just their frontman, he was their leader. Their survival depended on him finding a new sound. He worked tirelessly, pushing the sessions late into the early hours, and that's when the whispers started. One night, Barry reportedly heard something through his headphones, a voice, faint but clear, singing harmony on a track that no one had recorded yet. He thought it was a mistake. He asked the engineer to replay the tape, but the voice was still there. No one else heard it. But Barry swore it was real. He didn't mention it again, at least not for many years. What's confirmed is that those sessions were long, intense, and emotionally draining. Barry later admitted that the chateau had an atmosphere unlike any place he'd ever recorded. Whether it was exhaustion, imagination, or something else entirely, no one can say for sure. But from that moment, something shifted in Barry. He began spending more time alone in the control room, staring at the empty recording space, as if waiting for something or someone to respond. And then came the night that would change everything. The Bee Gees sessions at Chateau de Hauteville were supposed to be a new beginning. Instead, they became something the brothers would never forget. At first, the atmosphere felt inspiring. The French countryside stretched endlessly outside the windows. The staff brought in bottles of wine and trays of cheese at sunset. And in those early days, Barry felt a flicker of hope, a reminder of what it meant to create again. But the honeymoon didn't last. Recording quickly turned into a marathon. The brothers were under pressure to deliver something fresh, something that would save their careers. Barry stayed up for days, sleeping just a few hours between takes. He'd hum melodies into a tape recorder, scribble lyrics on napkins, and pace the studio floor like a man searching for a door that didn't exist. Maurice tried to keep things light. Robin kept to himself, always analytical, always chasing perfection. But Barry, he carried the weight of all of it. According to one technician's recollection years later, Barry began to look pale and withdrawn. His voice was strong when he sang, but off stage, he'd grow quiet, lost in thought. Then came the first incident. Late one night, as they recorded vocal takes, the lights in the control room began to flicker. It wasn't unusual in old buildings, but the timing was uncanny, always during certain harmonies, always when Barry sang alone. At first they laughed it off, but then one of the playback tapes, a fresh reel, played something no one had recorded, a faint echo, a whisper, a low hum, like a voice buried in the static. The engineer tried to fix it, convinced it was a wiring issue, but when he played the tape again, the sound was gone. Still, Barry couldn't let it go. He swore the voice had said something, though no one else could make it out. To this day, there's no confirmed evidence of what was on that tape, but people who were there said Barry seemed different after that night. He stopped joking, he spent more time alone, and sometimes, when no one else was around, they'd hear him talking quietly in the studio, as if answering someone who wasn't there. Was it exhaustion, stress, or something else? No one could say, but the brothers noticed the change. Robin started sleeping with his door locked. Maurice stopped going downstairs after midnight, and Barry began to dream of leaving. As the days turned into weeks, the tension grew unbearable. The music was good, hauntingly good, but the energy in the studio was heavy. The brothers started arguing over tiny details, harmonies, arrangements, production choices. Things they used to agree on without a word now turned into shouting matches. It was as if the house itself wanted them divided. Barry tried to hold it together. He'd walk the grounds alone, humming unfinished melodies into the night air. He later described that time as lonely in a way I'd never felt before. The staff at the Chateau confirmed that Barry often stayed up until dawn, sitting by the piano, playing the same progression again and again. Sometimes they'd find candles burned down to the base, smoke still curling into the air, long after everyone had gone to bed. One assistant claimed, and again this was only rumor, that Barry once asked if anyone had come into the control room the night before, because someone had adjusted the faders on the mixer while he slept. No one had touched them, at least, not according to the staff. Another said Barry refused to use one particular microphone after a session because he thought he heard breathing through it. He joked about it once, calling it the ghost mic, but by the end of that week, no one was laughing. The Bee Gees eventually finished their sessions in France and returned home, but something had shifted permanently. Barry wasn't the same man who had arrived there. He was quieter, more introspective, and some say more determined than ever to take control of the band's direction. Whether it was a breakdown or a breakthrough depends on who you ask. Robin later said in an interview that their time in France pushed them to the edge, but gave them a new fire. Maurice, who rarely spoke about spiritual things, once hinted that they had felt a strange presence in that studio, and Barry simply said, "That house had a soul." He never explained what he meant, but not long after those sessions, the Bee Gees' sound began to change dramatically. The music became deeper, funkier, and more emotional. It was as if Barry had taken everything from those sleepless nights, the tension, the fear, the mystery, and turned it into something no one saw coming. Within 2 years, they would release Main Course, the album that redefined their careers and introduced the world to Jive Talkin. The Bee Gees were reborn. But the cost of that rebirth may have been what Barry experienced in that French Chateau, because behind the glitter and success of the disco era, Barry would later admit there was a darkness he never fully understood, a shadow that followed him long after the music stopped, and though he never said the word haunted, when asked decades later about that studio, his response was quiet, almost reflective. He said, "We left something behind there. I don't know what it was, but I hope it stays." When the Bee Gees finally left France, they didn't look back. Their flight home was quiet, too quiet. Robin stared out the window, headphones on. Maurice tried to make small talk, but Barry sat still, gazing at the clouds, lost in thought. Something about that trip had changed him. Friends later said he seemed older after France, not in years but in spirit. He'd always been calm and collected, but now there was a strange stillness about him, like someone who had seen something he couldn't explain. Back in London, the brothers tried to shake it off. They threw themselves back into writing, producing, and recording. But even in new studios, Barry carried something invisible with him. He became more controlling about the sound, more meticulous, more obsessed. Every detail mattered. Every echo, every harmony, every small vibration in a vocal take. It was as if he was chasing perfection, or maybe trying to erase the imperfections that haunted him in France. What's confirmed is that after their return, the Bee Gees began experimenting with a new rhythm-driven sound. Barry's voice grew raspier, more emotional, and he started using his now iconic falsetto in ways no one had heard before. Some say that creative explosion came from struggle, others believe the time in France broke down. Barry's barriers, stripping away everything until only raw emotion remained. But there's also a persistent rumor that Barry told a friend he heard a different kind of music in the Chateau, something that came to him in the dark. He never repeated that claim publicly, and there's no proof of it. But years later, he would describe Jive Talkin, their comeback hit, as a sound that felt like it came out of nowhere. Whether it was coincidence or inspiration from the unknown, what matters is this: the Bee Gees left that chateau defeated and came back unstoppable. For decades, Barry refused to discuss what really happened in France. In every interview, he would brush off questions about Chateau de Rouville with a polite laugh or a short answer. If someone mentioned the rumors, he'd simply say, "People love ghost stories." But those who knew him best could tell it wasn't a joke. Maurice passed away in 2003, Robin followed in 2012, and with each loss, Barry grew quieter. The last surviving Gibb brother, carrying all the memories and all the secrets alone. He once said, "When you lose your brothers, you lose your past." But there were still pieces of that past he never spoke of. In one rare interview, years later, Barry finally allowed himself to revisit those sessions in France. He didn't say much, but what he said was enough to make longtime fans stop and think. He described the atmosphere as thick, the nights as too long, and the feeling of something beyond music in the air. When asked if he meant supernatural, Barry only smiled and said, "It depends what you believe in." That moment, subtle as it was, confirmed what many had wondered all along, that something did happen in that chateau, maybe not ghosts or spirits, but something deeper. Barry hinted that the pressure they felt there pushed them past their limits, emotionally, physically, even spiritually. He admitted that it was one of the hardest times in their career, and that he nearly walked away from it all. That's the only time he's ever acknowledged what fans now call the French Château breakdown. It's not clear whether he meant an emotional collapse, a creative one, or something else entirely. But he confirmed enough to make people realize the rumors weren't just myth, there was truth in them, however blurry, and it's that truth, hidden between exhaustion and mystery, that made the story of the French Château one of the most haunting chapters in Bee Gees' history. When Barry returned from France, he didn't just write new songs, he poured his soul into them. The heartbreak, the fear, the strange energy he carried from that place, it all became music. You can hear it in Nights on Broadway, in Fanny Be Tender With My Love, and of course in Jive Talkin'. Songs filled with rhythm, darkness, and a kind of emotional electricity that wasn't there before. The Bee Gees weren't just back, they were transformed. They had found their new voice, and the world couldn't get enough of it. By 1977, they were global icons again, dominating charts and dance floors with Stayin Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, and Night Fever. But behind those glittering disco anthems, Barry's eyes still carried something distant. He smiled for the cameras, but those who looked closely could see it, a quiet melancholy. He never returned to Chateau de Rouville. In fact, none of the Bee Gees did. After their sessions, the Chateau continued to host other artists for a few years before eventually closing its doors. Some said the building had fallen into disrepair, others said it simply lost its magic. A few, whispering through the years, claimed it was never the same after the Bee Gees left. That's rumor, of course, but poetic in a way, because the Chateau gave Barry something priceless, pain that became art. Whatever happened there, real or imagined, forced him to reach deeper than ever before, and from that haunting silence came the sound that would define the rest of his life. When he finally spoke about it at 79, he didn't dwell on fear, he spoke of gratitude. He said the Chateau was where the Bee Gees found themselves again. Maybe that was his way of saying the darkness was worth it. Maybe it was his way of letting go. Half a century after those haunting sessions in France, Barry Gibb sat for an interview at his home in Miami. The room was bright, filled with sunlight and family photos, but when the reporter brought up Chateau de Rouville, the air shifted. Barry paused for a long moment before he spoke. He didn't deny the rumors. He didn't laugh them off. He simply said, "There was something about that place I'll never forget, something I don't want to understand." It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging what fans had speculated for decades, that whatever happened inside those stone walls left a mark on him that never fully healed. He went on to describe how those sessions pushed the Bee Gees to reinvent themselves, how the feeling of being trapped in that mansion cut off from the world forced them to find a new sound. He called it a turning point in our lives. When the interviewer asked if he believed the studio was haunted, Barry smiled and shook his head. Then he said softly, "Maybe it wasn't the place that was haunted, maybe it was us." Those words would echo across the Bee Gees fan community for years, because behind that sentence was the pain of loss, the weight of outliving everyone he loved. Robin gone, Maurice gone, Andy, their younger brother, gone long before his time. Barry was the last man standing, and as he looked back on his life, that old chateau in France was no longer a rumor, it was a memory he carried alone. He didn't describe ghosts, he didn't describe visions, but he admitted something had happened there, something that changed how he heard music forever. The interview ended quietly. Barry looked off into the distance and said, almost to himself, "I still hear it sometimes, that sound." No one knows what he meant, but maybe he wasn't talking about a sound at all. Maybe he was talking about a feeling, the echo of a moment that never truly fades. Today, Chateau de Rouville still stands, restored, renovated, its walls now silent again. Visitors say it's peaceful, even beautiful, but for Barry Gibb, it will always be the place where the Bee Gees were reborn. When he reflects on that time, he calls it a creative awakening, but fans hear something deeper in his words, the undertone of someone who had to lose himself before he could be found again. Maybe the rumor was never really about ghosts or haunting at all. Maybe it was about what haunts all artists, the fear of fading, of disappearing into time, of making something so beautiful that it hurts, because from that dark chateau came light. From Barry's breakdown came the sound that defined a generation, and from the silence came songs that still move millions of hearts today. He doesn't deny that France was a turning point. He doesn't deny that something changed him. He only refuses to define it. Perhaps that's his way of keeping the mystery alive, of letting the rumor stand as part of the legend, and maybe that's why, after all these years, the story still feels unfinished. Because Barry Gibb, the last BG, the man who carried their legacy through decades of grief and glory, has never needed to confirm everything. He just needed to say enough to make us listen again. At 79, Barry no longer runs from the past. He visits it, like an old friend who never really left. He once said, "You don't get over things like that, you carry them, and you learn to sing through them," and that's exactly what he did. Maybe that's why his voice still sounds so haunting, even after all these years, because it was forged in a place where silence spoke louder than sound. So when people ask, did something really happen in that French chateau, the answer depends on what you believe. Some say it was just a studio, some say it was haunted, but for Barry Gibb, it was a moment in time, a moment that shaped the man, the music, and the myth, and sometimes that's enough. You've been watching RetroWaves, where music legends live on through the stories they never told.